Welcome to our deep dive into the computational theory of mind.
Oh, yeah. This would be a good one.
You've sent us a ton of readings,
Yeah.
mostly from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy.
Oh, wow.
And
Heavy stuff.
yeah, it's going to be some really heady stuff.
Yeah.
We're going to be tackling things like the nature of thought, the potential for AI, and whether our brains might actually function like super intricate machines.
It's a big one.
Ready to unpack all this.
Absolutely. And, for a philosopher,
Yeah.
these aren't just like abstract questions. These cut right to the heart of what it means to be human.
Yeah.
We'll be exploring how thinking itself might be a form of computation.
Oh, wow.
And that takes us on a journey from theoretical constructs like the Turing machine
Okay.
all the way to cutting-edge AI.
Okay, so let's start by setting the stage.
Right.
Imagine for a moment
Okay.
that your brain isn't this mysterious gray blob,
Okay.
but rather a system that processes information,
Okay.
kind of like a computer. That's the fundamental idea behind the computational theory of mind,
Right.
or CTM for short.
CTM.
It might sound a little strange at first,
Yeah.
but stick with us.
It's a powerful idea,
Yeah.
and it all begins with understanding what we mean by computation.
Okay.
A great place to start is with the concept of a Turing machine.
Okay.
Now, this isn't a physical machine you can buy on Amazon,
Right.
but a theoretical model developed by Alan Turing back in the 1930s.
Wait, the 1930s. That's way before computers as we know them even existed.
Exactly. That's what makes it so remarkable.
Wow.
Turing envisioned this machine that could read and write symbols on an infinitely long tape,
Okay.
following a set of predefined rules.
Okay.
It's a very simple model in essence. But here's the kicker.
Okay.
All modern computers, no matter how complex, are
Yeah.
essentially elaborate Turing machines at their core.
So how does this theoretical machine help us understand the human mind? I'm sure our philosopher listener is curious about that leap.
The beauty of the Turing machine is that it shows us how seemingly complex processes can be broken down into a series of simple rule-based operations.
Okay.
And that's the core idea behind the computational theory of mind, that thinking itself, regardless of the physical hardware involved,
Right.
might operate in a similar way.
So are we saying our brains are literally Turing machines with an endless tape running through them?
Not quite. It's more nuanced than that.
Okay.
Our brains are incredibly complex with billions of neurons firing in parallel.
Right.
But the idea is that at a certain level of abstraction, the process of thinking can be modeled as a kind of computation.
Okay. I think I'm starting to get the picture.
Okay.
So we've got these theoretical machines that can compute.
Right.
But what about building actual machines that can think?
Yeah.
That's where artificial intelligence comes in.
Right. The history of AI is fascinating, and it's really taken off in recent years.
Yeah, it has.
Early successes like the logic theorist program, which could prove mathematical theorems,
Oh, wow.
paved the way for things like Deep Blue beating Kasparov at chess,
Yeah.
and more recently, the rise of self-driving cars.
Those are great examples.
Yeah.
When you see a self-driving car navigating traffic,
Yeah.
it's almost eerie
Yeah.
how intelligent it seems.
Mm-hmm.
But does that really mean it's thinking in the same way we do?
That's a question that goes right to the heart of the Turing test,
Oh, okay.
which Turing himself proposed. Can a machine interact with us in a way that is indistinguishable from a human being?
Right.
If it can,
Yeah.
does that mean it's genuinely thinking?
That's a tough one.
Yeah.
I'm not sure I have an answer to that.
It's a good one.
But it seems like even if a machine can pass the Turing test,
Yeah.
there might still be a difference between mimicking thought
Yeah.
and actually experiencing it.
Precisely. And that's where things get really interesting from a philosophical perspective. If we're trying to understand the mind as a computational system,
Yeah.
we need to delve deeper into what that actually means.
All right, let's dive deeper then. We've talked about Turing machines and AI,
Yeah.
but we haven't really explained what the computational theory of mind is all about.
Right. So let's get specific.
Okay.
The classical computational theory of mind, or CCTM,
Right.
proposes that the mind, our computational system,
Yeah.
but it's not saying our brains are literally made of circuits and wires.
Okay.
It's saying that thinking itself, regardless of the physical stuff doing it,
Right.
is a form of computation.
So it's not about the hardware, but the software, so to speak.
Exactly. The focus is on the process of information processing.
Okay.
The CCTM argues that mental states like believing something or feeling happy are defined by their functional role within the system,
Okay.
not the specific physical stuff they're made of.
It's like saying a heart is defined by its function,
Right.
pumping blood,
Yeah.
regardless of whether it's made of flesh and blood or, in some futuristic scenario, metal and gears.
That's a great analogy. And that brings us to the concept of functionalism,
Okay.
which is central to the CCTM.
Mm-hmm.
Functionalism says that mental states are defined by their functional role,
Okay.
not their physical makeup.
Okay. I'm starting to see how these pieces fit together.
Good.
But if the mind is like a computer,
Yeah.
what's the code it's running on?
That's where the idea of a language of thought comes in.
Okay.
Sometimes called mentalese.
Mentalese.
It's not English, French, or any language we speak out loud.
Right.
It's a hypothetical system of mental symbols
Okay.
that our brains manipulate to produce thought.
So it's like a mental code
Yeah.
that our brains use to process information.
Exactly. And here's something that might surprise you.
Okay.
This idea has been around for centuries.
Wow.
Philosophers in the Middle Ages were already speculating about a language of thought.
Wow. I had no idea.
The modern version just gives it more of a computational spin.
So this mentalese, if it exists,
Yeah.
is what allows our brains to do all the amazing things that minds do.
That's the idea. The CCTM argues that this language of thought, combined with the computational power of our brains,
Yeah.
can explain some of the most remarkable features of human cognition.
Like what, for example?
Well, consider the systematicity of thought.
Okay.
We can think John loves Mary and easily understand Mary loves John just by rearranging the mental words in our heads.
Yeah.
This kind of structured thinking is hard to explain
Yeah.
if thoughts are just random neural firings.
Right.
But if we have a language of thought,
Yeah.
it makes sense that our thoughts would follow certain rules,
Okay.
like a kind of mental grammar.
That makes a lot of sense. And there's another fascinating aspect of thought.
What's that?
We can think an unlimited number of things.
Yeah,
Our thoughts aren't limited by the number of brain cells we have.
right.
How does the CCTM explain that?
That's called the productivity of thought. And the CCTM says it's because we have these basic mental words and rules for combining them into an infinite number of sentences.
Yeah, okay.
It's like having a finite set of Lego bricks that you can use to build an endless variety of structures.
So it's not that we have a separate brain cell for every possible thought,
Right.
but that we have a system for generating new thoughts based on a limited set of building blocks.
Exactly. It's a much more elegant and powerful explanation
Yeah.
than simply saying that our thoughts are just random neural firings.
Okay. I'm really starting to appreciate the elegance of the CCTM,
It is elegant.
but I also know there are other ways to think about computational models of the mind.
Oh, yeah.
We've been talking about Turing machines,
Yeah.
but what about neural networks?
Great point. Neural networks are another type of computational model,
Okay.
and they're inspired by the structure of the brain itself. They consist of interconnected nodes or neurons
Right.
that can activate or inhibit each other.
Right.
The strength of the connections between these nodes changes as the network learns, kind of like how our brains form new pathways when we learn something new.
And this is relevant to our philosopher listener
Yeah,
because...
the neural networks have become incredibly powerful tools in artificial intelligence.
Oh, hey.
They're behind many of the AI systems we see today,
Wow.
from image recognition software
Right.
to language models like ChatGPT.
Oh, yeah.
These systems are trained on massive amounts of data,
Right.
and they learn by adjusting the connections in their neural networks.
So if neural networks are inspired by the brain,
Yeah.
does that mean they're a better model of the mind than the Turing machine?
That's a question that has sparked a lot of debate.
Yeah, I bet.
Are neural networks and the classical computational model rivals? Or
Yeah.
can they work together?
It seems like they're both trying to explain how thinking works,
Yeah,
but from different angles.
exactly. Some people think neural networks completely replace the need for a Turing-style model. They argue that neural networks are more biologically plausible since they're based on the structure of the brain.
Right.
And they're very good at modeling learning.
That's the eliminative connectionist view, right?
Yes.
They think neural networks are the whole story.
Precisely. But others think neural networks and Turing machines are just different levels of explanation.
Okay.
They might argue that neural networks show us how our brains carry out Turing-style computation.
Okay.
It's like saying we can describe a computer program at a high level,
Yeah.
but underneath it all, there are still logic, gates, and circuits doing the real work.
That's the implementationist, connectionist
Yeah.
view, right?
Right.
They see neural networks as a way of implementing classical computation.
Exactly. And of course, both sides have good points.
Right.
Neural networks are great at modeling certain aspects of the brain,
Yeah.
but can they really explain the complex structure and unlimited nature of human thought
Right.
as well as the classic model can? That's the big question.
So we've got these two competing or maybe complementary views of how computation might work in the brain.
Yeah.
But there's still this nagging question
Yeah.
of how we get from computation to the actual content of our thoughts.
You're hitting on a fundamental challenge for any computational theory of mind,
Okay.
the representation problem.
The representation problem.
If our thoughts are just computations,
Yeah.
how do those computations actually represent the real world? How do they have meaning?
Right. Computers can manipulate symbols according to rules,
Yeah.
but they don't understand what those symbols mean.
Right.
So how do our brains get from mindless symbol manipulation
Yeah.
to actual thoughts about things?
This gets into the difference between syntax,
Okay.
which is the rules for manipulating symbols,
Right.
and semantics, which is the meaning of those symbols.
Right.
Computers are great at syntax,
Yeah.
but where does the semantics come from?
That's a big question. It seems like we need something more than just computation to explain how our thoughts actually connect to the world.
Exactly. And that's where things get really interesting.
Okay.
We have to start thinking about how our minds interact with the world,
Right.
how our experiences shape the content of our thoughts.
So it's not just about what's going on inside our heads,
Right.
but also about our relationship to the world around us.
Exactly. And that brings us to the debate between internalism and externalism.
Internalism and externalism.
Is the content of our thoughts all in our heads,
Okay.
or does it depend on our connection to the world outside?
That's a fascinating question.
Yeah.
It seems like our thoughts are both about the world and shaped by the world.
Yeah.
How do those two things come together?
That's something philosophers are still grappling with.
Yeah.
But one way to think about it is through the idea of content involving computation.
Okay.
Maybe, just maybe, computation itself can be described in terms of meaning.
So it's not just about manipulating meaningless symbols,
Yeah.
but the computations are actually about something. That sounds promising.
It's also potentially very complex.
It is, but it's an attempt to bridge the gap
Right.
between the formal, rule-based nature of computation and the fact that our thoughts clearly have meaning
Right.
and represent the world around us.
Okay, so we've gone from abstract Turing machines
Yeah.
to this incredibly complex idea of content involving computation.
It's quite a journey.
I'm starting to see why the computational theory of mind is such a rich and challenging topic.
It is. And we've only just scratched the surface.
Oh, no.
There are so many more layers to this onion, so many more philosophical puzzles to explore.
Well, luckily for us, we have plenty of time in this deep dive to unpack it all.
We do.
I can't wait to see where this conversation takes us next.
Me neither. It's going to be a fascinating journey.
Yeah, I think so too.
You know, it's fascinating how we've gone from these abstract computational models to the very essence of what it means to think and represent the world.
Yeah.
It's almost like we're trying to reverse engineer the mind itself. It really is.
Yeah.
But before we get too carried away,
Yeah.
I think it's important to remember that computationalism itself
Yeah.
isn't some monolithic unified theory.
Right.
There are actually different ways to think about what computation is
Right.
and how it might apply to the mind.
That's a really important point. We've been talking about computation in a general sense,
Yeah.
but philosophers have come up with various conceptions of
Yeah.
what constitutes computation.
Right.
And those different conceptions can have significant implications
Yeah.
for how we understand the mind.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Can you give us a tour of these different flavors of computationalism?
Sure.
Our philosopher listeners probably eager to hear how these nuances play out.
Absolutely. One way to think about computation is as information processing.
Okay.
This view sees computation as the manipulation of information,
Okay.
regardless of the specific physical system carrying it out.
So it's not about the hardware,
Right.
but about the information itself and how it's transformed.
Exactly. But then, of course,
We run into the question of what we even mean by information.
Right.
It's a word that gets thrown around a lot,
Right.
but it can have different meanings depending on the context.
Right. I can see how that could get slippery.
Indeed. In information theory, information is often defined in terms of reducing uncertainty.
Okay.
It's about the amount of surprise or novelty contained in a message.
Mm-hmm.
But there's also this idea of information as natural meaning
Okay.
based on reliable correlations in the world.
Okay.
Like smoke means fire, or
Yeah.
dark clouds mean rain.
Ah, I see. But how does all of this relate to computation specifically?
Yeah.
Does simply processing information in any of these senses mean that something is computing?
That's a great question. It gets to the heart of what distinguishes a truly computational system
Okay.
from something that's merely processing information
Yeah.
in a more passive way. Think about a tape recorder, for example.
Okay.
It records and plays back sounds,
Right.
which you could argue is a form of information processing.
Right.
But is it really computing in the way we're talking about here?
That's a tricky one. It seems like it's storing and retrieving information,
Yeah.
but not necessarily transforming it in a way that we would typically associate with computation.
Exactly. So some philosophers might argue that computation requires more than just information processing.
Okay.
It might involve the systematic manipulation of symbols according to rules,
Okay.
or the evaluation of functions,
Mm-hmm.
or the creation of complex representations.
Okay, so we've got information processing as one way to think about computation.
Yeah.
What are some of the other approaches philosophers have come up with?
Well, there's a functionalist approach,
Yeah.
which we touched on earlier.
Right.
This view sees computation as the evaluation of functions.
Yeah.
It's about the input-output relationship,
Okay.
regardless of the specific steps involved in getting from input to output.
So it's not about the internal workings of the system,
Right.
but about the overall transformation it performs.
Precisely. Think of a mathematical function.
Okay.
Put in certain values,
Yeah.
and you get a specific result.
Right.
Some philosophers argue that computation is essentially just doing that,
Okay.
evaluating functions.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
But how does this apply to the mind as a computer?
Right.
Our thoughts aren't just abstract mathematical objects, are they?
Yeah.
They have meaning, they represent the world.
And we're back to the representation problem again.
Right.
It seems like we can't escape it,
Yeah.
no matter which conception of computation we adopt.
Right.
But some philosophers think we can actually bridge the gap
Okay.
between computation and representation
Mm-hmm.
by talking about content involving computation.
Right, we touched on that earlier.
Yes.
Can you remind us how that works?
The idea is that computational descriptions themselves can involve meaning.
Okay.
It's not just about manipulating meaningless symbols, but about performing computations
Yeah.
that are intrinsically about something.
So the computation itself carries semantic content.
That's the idea.
Yeah.
That sounds promising, but also potentially very complex.
It is. But it's an attempt to reconcile the formal syntactic aspects of computation
Right.
with the fact that our thoughts clearly have semantic content.
Right.
They're not just about manipulating symbols,
Yeah.
but about representing the world
Right.
and making sense of it.
Okay, that's information processing.
Yeah.
Function evaluation
Mm-hmm.
and content involving computation.
Yes.
What other philosophical takes on computation should we throw into the mix for our listener?
Another approach is structuralism.
Okay.
This view sees computation as describing an abstract causal structure.
Okay.
It's not about the specific physical stuff a system is made of,
Okay.
but about the patterns of interaction between its parts.
So the same computational model could be implemented in a brain,
Yeah.
a computer, or even a system of gears and livers,
Right.
as long as the underlying relationships are the same.
Exactly. It's about the organization, not the physical instantiation.
Okay.
This ties back to the idea of multiple realizability. Okay.
Which was so important to early functionalists.
Yeah.
The same mental state could be realized in different physical systems,
Right.
as long as those systems have the right functional organization.
Oh, that makes sense.
Yeah.
And then there's the mechanistic approach, which is kind of similar, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Mechanistic theories of computation see computational systems as complex mechanisms,
Okay.
where each part has a specific function,
Okay.
and they all interact in a rule-governed way.
Mm-hmm.
It's a very detailed bottom-up approach,
Right.
focusing on the nuts and bolts of how a system works.
Okay, so we've got at least 5 different ways to think about computation.
Yeah, at least so. Yeah.
Information processing,
Mm-hmm.
function evaluation,
Yes.
content involving computation,
Mm,
structuralism, and mechanism.
right.
That's a lot to digest.
It is. And, there are probably even more out there.
Yeah.
But the key takeaway here
Come on.
is that computationalism isn't this monolithic thing.
Right.
It's a rich and varied landscape of ideas.
Each with its strengths and weaknesses.
So where does that leave us? Does this mean we should just pick and choose which theory of computation we like best?
Well,
depending on what we're trying to explain.
Well, some philosophers would advocate for a kind of pluralism.
Yeah.
They'd say there's no one true theory of computation,
Okay.
and that different approaches might be useful
Okay.
for different purposes.
So it's not about finding the one right answer,
Hmm.
but about using the right tools for the job.
That's one way to think about it. But of course, not everyone is comfortable with that kind of open-endedness.
Right.
Some philosophers will still argue that there is a best, most fundamental conception of computation,
Right.
and we just need to keep searching for it.
And while they're searching,
Yeah.
they'll keep generating more fascinating philosophical puzzles.
Exactly.
But hey, that's what keeps things interesting, right?
Right.
But even with all these different ways of thinking about computation,
Yeah.
there are still some pretty serious challenges to the whole idea that the mind as a computer aren't there.
Absolutely. Not everyone buys into the computational theory of mind,
Right.
and for good reason. There are some compelling arguments against it. We've talked about the representation problem, which is a big one.
Yeah.
But there are others too.
Oh, I was hoping we'd get to the juicy objections.
Oh, yeah.
Let's hear some of those.
One common objection is based on Gödel's incompleteness theorems.
Okay.
These theorems show that there are certain mathematical truths
Mm-hmm.
that can't be proven within any formal system.
Okay.
So some people argue that this means human minds can grasp truths
Right.
that computers can't
Mm-hmm.
because our minds aren't bound by those formal limits.
So it's like saying our minds have some special sauce
Yeah.
that allows us to go beyond the capabilities of
Yeah.
any formal system, even a Turing machine.
Right.
But isn't that a bit of a leap?
It is. And most philosophers and logicians agree that this objection doesn't really hold up. There's no reason to think Gödel's theorems say anything about the limitations of human minds,
Oh,
or that we're somehow exempt from the laws of logic and computation.
okay. That's one objection
Yeah.
down. What else do the critics have up their sleeves?
Another argument focuses on the limits of computational modeling.
Yeah.
Critics point to things like creativity,
Mm.
intuition,
Oh, yeah.
or our ability to understand and respond to emotions.
Right.
These seem like very human capabilities
Yeah.
that are hard to imagine being captured by any kind of computer program.
Right. Could a computer ever write a symphony like Beethoven or
Yeah.
fall in love
Right.
or experience the joy of a beautiful sunset?
Yeah.
These are things that seem to go beyond
Right.
just processing information or
Right.
following rules.
And this is where even some proponents of computationalism get a little uneasy.
Okay.
The philosopher Jerry Fodor, for example, who was a big defender of the computational theory of mind,
Right.
later became skeptical that it could explain everything about human cognition. He argued that certain kinds of reasoning, like abduction,
Abduction.
might be beyond the reach of computational modeling.
That sounds like something Sherlock Holmes would do.
It's a kind of reasoning where you infer the best explanation
Right.
for some set of observations.
Okay.
Like if you see someone with wet hair and an umbrella,
Right.
you might abduce that it's raining outside.
Right.
Fodor argued that this kind of reasoning involves a kind of global judgment
Okay.
about what's relevant, plausible,
Mm-hmm.
and simple
Okay.
that can't be captured by a Turing-style machine,
Okay.
just looking at local features of a problem.
That's interesting. So even someone who is a strong advocate for computationalism
Yeah.
acknowledged that there might be limits to what it can explain.
Exactly. And this is still a very active area of debate.
Okay.
Can we find ways to model things like creativity and abduction computationally?
Right.
Or are there aspects of human thought that are fundamentally different from anything a computer can do?
I guess we'll have to wait and see what the philosophers and AI researchers come up with.
Right.
But what about the arguments that focus on the temporal aspects of thought?
Yeah.
I've heard some people say that computational models are too rigid and step-by-step
Yeah.
to capture the fluid dynamic nature of thinking.
Those are the temporal arguments against computationalism.
Okay.
They point out that thinking happens in time
Right.
and that it's often very fast and fluid.
Yeah.
Critics worry that traditional computational models,
Mhm.
with their discrete steps and stages,
Right.
don't accurately reflect the continuous flow of mental activity.
It's like saying our thoughts aren't like a computer program running line by line.
Yeah.
They're more like a river,
Yeah.
constantly changing and adapting to the terrain.
That's a great analogy. And this is where some people advocate for dynamical systems theory
Yeah.
as a better way to understand the mind.
Okay.
It focuses on continuous change over time
Mhm.
rather than discrete steps.
So it's less about algorithms and more about equations that describe how a system evolves over time.
Yeah.
I can see how that might be a more natural fit.
It could be.
for certain aspects of cognition.
Right. But proponents of computationalism would argue
Yeah.
that we can supplement computational models
Okay.
to take time into account.
Okay.
We can specify how long each computational step takes,
Right.
or we can model things in a more continuous way,
Yeah.
even within a computational framework.
So it's not an either situation necessarily.
Right.
Maybe computation and dynamical systems can work together
It could.
to give us a fuller picture of the mind.
That's certainly a possibility. And then, of
Yeah.
course, we have the whole movement of embodied cognition,
Right.
which really emphasizes the connection between mind, body, and environment.
The idea is that our thinking isn't just happening in some isolated mental space,
Right.
but it's deeply intertwined with our physical actions
Yeah.
and our interactions with the world around us. Yeah.
Exactly. Critics of computationalism argue that traditional computational models are too brain-bound.
Hmm.
They don't adequately account for the role of the body and the environment
Right.
in shaping our thoughts and behaviors.
So it's not just about what's going on inside our heads,
Yeah.
but about the constant feedback loop between our minds, our bodies, and the world we live in.
Yeah. A complex interplay.
And this has
Yeah.
implications for how we think about AI too, right?
Absolutely. If we want to build truly intelligent machines,
Yeah.
can we just focus on creating powerful computational systems?
Right.
Or do we need to think about embodiment as well?
Yeah.
Do we need to give robots bodies
Right,
that
yeah.
can interact with the world in a way that's
Right.
more like how humans do?
Those are big questions.
Huge questions.
It seems like with every answer we uncover,
Yeah.
even more profound mysteries emerge.
That's the beauty of it, isn't it?
Yeah.
This quest to understand the mind is an ongoing journey.
Yeah.
And there's always something new to discover.
Wow. We've really gone down the philosophical rabbit hole with this deep dive.
Yeah.
We've explored different conceptions of computation, wrestled with the representation problem,
Right.
and even tackled some pretty serious challenges to the whole idea of the mind as a computer.
It's a lot.
It's a lot to take in, even for a philosophy enthusiast.
And, you know, even if we accept that the mind as us a computational system,
Right.
which is still a matter of debate,
Yeah.
there's this even bigger question looming in the background.
Oh, I know exactly what you're going to say, the big C word.
Yeah,
Consciousness.
you got it. Consciousness is often seen as the ultimate mystery of the mind.
Yeah.
Can a computational system, no matter how complex or sophisticated,
Right.
truly experience the world in the way that we do?
It's a question that has haunted philosophers for centuries.
Yeah.
And it doesn't seem like the computational theory of mind gives us any easy answers.
It really doesn't.
Mm.
Some proponents of computationalism might argue that consciousness is simply an emergent property of sufficiently complex computational systems.
Okay.
Once you have enough interconnected parts
Yeah.
with the right kind of organization and processing power,
Okay.
consciousness just pops out like magic.
But does that really explain what it feels like to be conscious?
Right.
Can we ever get from algorithms and symbols
Hmm.
to the subjective experience of seeing a red rose,
Yeah.
hearing a beautiful piece of music,
Right.
or feeling the warmth of the sun on our skin?
That's the crux of the problem.
Yeah.
And many philosophers, even those who are sympathetic to computationalism,
Yeah.
are skeptical that consciousness can be explained solely in computational terms.
Right.
They argue that it might require something more,
Yeah.
something that goes beyond our current understanding of computation.
So even if we figure out all the nuts and bolts of how the brain computes,
Right.
we might still be left with this fundamental mystery of how those computations give rise to conscious experience.
Exactly. And this is where things get really exciting. The mystery of consciousness is driving a lot of cutting-edge research at the intersection of neuroscience, cognitive science, and philosophy.
Oh, wow.
People are exploring new ways to think about consciousness,
Yeah.
new models of how it might arise from physical systems.
It seems like we're constantly pushing the boundaries of what we know and what we can imagine.
Absolutely.
And with each step forward,
Yeah.
we realize how much more there is to discover.
That's the beauty of this field.
Yeah.
It's a constant exploration,
Yeah.
a never-ending quest to understand the most complex and fascinating thing in the universe and the human mind.
And who knows, maybe someday we'll crack the code of consciousness.
I hope so.
Maybe we'll finally understand what it means to be a thinking, feeling, experiencing being.
That would certainly be a groundbreaking discovery.
It would.
But even if we never fully solve the mystery of consciousness,
Right?
the journey itself is incredibly rewarding.
Yeah.
Exploring these big questions about the nature of mind computation and reality
Right.
is what makes us human.
I completely agree. It's a journey that takes us to the very heart of what it means to exist.
Well said. And on that profound note, I think it's time to wrap up this deep dive.
Okay,
We've covered a lot of ground today.
we have. We started with the basics of Turing machines,
Right.
explored the computational theory of mind in all its complexity,
Mm-hmm.
and even delved into the philosophical abyss of consciousness.
We did.
We've grappled with the representation problem, consider different conceptions of computation,
That's a lot.
and confronted some of the toughest challenges to the idea that the mind is a computer.
Big questions.
And through it all, I think we've given our listener, our philosophy enthusiast,
I hope so.
plenty to ponder.
Maybe we've sparked a new line of inquiry.
Yeah.
A new philosophical obsession.
Or at the very least, a renewed sense of wonder about the mysteries of the mind.
Exactly. Because ultimately, understanding the mind is about understanding ourselves
Yes.
and our place in the universe.
Right.
And that's a journey worth taking no matter where it leads.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, keep those philosophical gears turning.
Absolutely.